Today we're gonna grow some apes and go under the command of King Leonidas to fight the Persians and find out what the feat of the 300 Spartans really was. The very name of the state of Sparta is not too correct and has taken root thanks to the Romans. Look at any shoot of Spartan warrior, you can clearly see the letter I there, and in Greek it sounds like lambda. The reason is simple, the Spartans didn't call themselves Spartans, they were called Lacedemonians, after the city of Lacedemon. It was later the city was more often called Sparta, which is where the modern name came from. The second prejudice is the positioning of Sparta as a closed city. No, my friend, Sparta is a state that existed for almost 1,000 years, from the 11th to the 1st century BC. At that time there were many states on the territory of Greece, and our Sparta was situated in the south of the Peloponnese peninsula, in the region called Laconia. By the way, the concept of laconic speech came from there, because the people who lived in Sparta were not very talkative. Our hero's name is Basil, which translates from Greek as a king. Around 480 BC, Sparta is stronger than ever. The state extends its influence over almost the entire Peloponnesian peninsula. Nearby is the Athenian power, which our state doesn't like. But the main problem is not Athens. To the east is the huge empire of the Achaemenids, known in common parlance as the Persians. They don't know the sorts of Greeks and are charged with one simple goal: to take over all Greeks' land. This is a serious problem because one look at the map is enough to understand how much more resources the Persians have people and banal unity. Whereas Greece was divided into many states that only entered into an alliance in the face of threat, the Persians fought on a single front. Looking ahead, they lost. Why? Because for the Greeks the art of war is sacred, and for the Spartans it is life. Our Basil was a Hanei, as Spartan citizens were called. They were simple laborers, mepheks, they were neodomos who were considered only half-citizens, but the hardest fate awaited the helots. There was the purest case of Spartans, for the most part peasants, and they oscillated somewhere between serfs and slaves. But the structure of Sparta was more complicated than that of similar states. So for example, the family of our Basil could have a dozen helots, with plots of land in subordination. On paper, they were serfs and obliged to give a fixed percentage of the harvest to Basil's family. The difference between Sparta and other states of the time is that the world couldn't increase this percentage in any way, it was established by war. Basil was lucky to be a citizen of Sparta, because for one citizen there were 10 helots, who often by the way arranged a rebellion. They were punished as severely as possible, and once a year the Spartan rulers even declared war on their own helots in order to kill the most violent ones and keep everyone in line. Yes, you are not wrong, the Spartans were actually declaring war on themselves. After all, we are talking about one of the most brutal states in history, where everything was subordinated to one goal: war. Basil, like other boys, left his family for the barracks at age 7. There the Spartan boys were lumped into groups and taught martial arts, sports and even reading, which was unusual for those times. There was always an adult next to the little ones. The children walked exclusively without shoes and in the same clothes in winter and summer. All the teenagers ate a special broth, its name was melanas, and it was pork cooked in blood mixed with vinegar. It was almost unreal to eat, and the children were starving. It was only encouraged by the state. In Sparta there was a cult of simplicity and also a cult of strength, and no one stopped teenagers from stealing. The punishment was severe, but a thief who wasn't caught was even praised for his skills. Now let's talk about myths. The most popular one is that children unfit for service were thrown off a mountain. This story comes from the philosopher Plutarch, who said that children who seemed suspicious to the council were thrown off a cliff. Supposedly no one asked the parents and the case was forced. The trouble is that Greek historians like to embellish reality. In fact, everything was simpler. The practice of infanticide was widespread not only in Sparta, but also in other regions of Greece and in Rome. But it applied to very sick children, so they didn't suffer. And for moderately handicapped citizens, there was a whole class. They were called Hippomeion, and they weren't very respected, but they weren't thrown off the mountain. And a long time ago, archaeologists studied all the gorges where children were allegedly thrown, and they didn't find any remain there. Let's return to our Basil. Children could wear clothes only at age of 12, and before that time they went around naked. They slept in the barracks on straw mats, and on the cold days many put nettles on the mats. It burned the body and kept the boys warm, allowing them to survive. To pass the final test at the age of 17, one had to climb the temple of Artemis. It was high up in the mountains, and the test consisted of the cruelest flogging. The boy had to endure a heap of whipping which stopped only after the first blood was shed. If the Spartan cried out, the blows continued and only increased in intensity after the blood. Such was the final exam of a Spartan warrior. Our Basil is a real warrior and passed the exam perfectly. But the exam only gave him the right to leave the closed barracks and appear in public. At 17, Basil had just begun military service to the state. To understand, it's not easy. Let's talk about salary. As we have already mentioned, even good food was considered a luxury in Sparta, so the phrase about the Spartan diet was not a deception. In a month, Basil received a standard ration of 3.5 buckets of barley, 2.5 kilos of cheese, a kilo of dates, and about a bit of liters of wine. Also, Basileus, like the other Spartan warriors, was allotted several metal rods, weighing 625 grams each. In an effort to avoid luxury and inequalities, a Spartan ruler Lycurgus came up with an interesting solution. With the accumulation of silver and gold, the death penalty was introduced, and the money in Sparta was these same iron rods. One weighed 625 grams, and to buy something of value, they had to carry the money in harness. Thus, any large transaction became public. It was impossible to move that much money unnoticed, and if the transaction was public, one might become interested and find out where one got that much money. A visitor to Sparta from another country was confronted with the fact that he couldn't buy anything with gold and silver coins. The Spartans looked on with horror. Such a scheme killed corruption and robbery at its root. What was the point of taking a bribe if you had to build a whole barn to hold the money, attracting attention? So Basil, in addition to his meager ration, got a few tweaks. With them, you could buy 10 kilos of meat and survive while training in a murderous daily regime. After all, a Spartan warrior is worth a dozen others, and this principle had to be maintained. In general, the equipment of warriors were conveyed with the movie 300 Spartans. Our Basil, like any heavily armed hoplite, wore a round shield, helmet, armor on his chest and greaves. For some reason, the movie decided to leave the torso of the Spartans exposed, but that's silly. In reality, it's not safe. But there were some light Spartan infantrymen who had spears, bows and darts. These guys fought with everything, for from the age of 7 they were trained to wield any weapon. The structure of the Spartan army was unique, and some details are successfully stolen by modern armies to this day. The clear line formation, strict discipline, and incredible physical strength made the Spartan army invincible. Line up in 8 rows deep, the phalanx could stretch for 1 kilometer, and until 371 BC, it was considered physically impossible to defeat such a formation. The reason was simple. Unlike other armies, the Spartans had no engineering structures. They simply marched forward relying on a brute force, and in it they outnumbered and defeated any enemy. Returning to Basil, let us recall that it is 480 BC and the war with the Persians is in full swing. Sparta is ruled by King Leonidas, who, like everyone else around him, is a fine warrior. Everyone is familiar with the movie 300 Spartans, and we will not repeat the obvious things. But just focus on the difference between the movie and reality. Let's assume that among the 300 soldiers will be our Vasya, along with King Leonid, who actually fought on the front lines. Together with his soldiers, Basil holds a defense against the Persian army in the gorge of Thermopylae. There, according to various estimates, were up to 250 Persians, and they were opposed by only 7,000 Greek soldiers. It is worth noting that this number of Spartans is not accidental. 300 people, this is the personal guard of the king and the most qualified soldiers, and they did 2 long days held for 20 times more superior to their opponent. They would have been held longer had it not been for Ephialtes, a local resident, who decided to make some extra money. He told the Persians about a mountain path that could be used to bypass the Greek positions. True, Spartan intelligence was awake and Leonidas was the first to know. The king immediately sent the whole army home, leaving himself with only 300 hoplite guards, but that was not romance, it was common sense. There was no worse sin in Sparta than retreating from a battlefield without a clear order. Since Leonidas was king, there was no place to wait for an order, and so as not to become an outcast whose name is covered in shame, Leonidas stayed on his own. And our Basil also chose a similar fate. The movie forgot only one detail. Along with the Spartans, other Greeks voluntarily remained, in particular 700 inhabitants of Thespia and 400 guys from Thebes. And also next to the Spartans were the Helots, whom we spoke about earlier. The number of slaves is not specified, but the fact that in the campaigns they were made into a semblance of light infantry is officially confirmed. So that against who went around Xerxes, there were not 300 but about 1,500 men. But even this doesn't cancel the fact of a crazy exploit, because these tiny people killed about 500 Persians, and not ordinary ones but immortal from the guard of the Persian army as well. In total, 4,000 Greeks were killed in 3 days, but the Persian losses more than 5 times exceeded this number. Thanks largely to the psychological factor, the Greeks would win the war and make a very profitable peace in the future. Don't be sad for our Basil. As you may have learned, his life was not the easiest, and to die in battle for a Spartan was the highest honor. For example, one of the 300 Spartan, Aristodemus, was ill at the time of the battle. Leonidas sent him to the countryside for treatment. After the king and the guard were outgunned, Aristodemus returned to Sparta, where he was nicknamed a coward, and even the guy's subsequent exploits had no effect on his position in society. A year later, in 497 BC, another Spartan, Pausanias, led the Greek army into the final battle against the Persians. It took place under the city of Plataea and was marked by the total defeat of the Persians. And this despite the fact that there were 3 times as many of them. Aristodemus, a member of the original 300 Spartans, became a hero in the battle, but even that didn't change his attitude. We conclude with another amusing fact. While Spartan boys honed their fighting skills from childhood, girls had to give birth to children. Their life was much simpler. Girls were taught to ride, to play sport, and were carefully monitored for their health, in a sense. Sparta can be considered the progenitor of feminism, but even the Spartan women handle weapons very well. For a second, this was a couple of thousand years ago, and only 100 years ago in some countries women didn't even know how to vote. This demonstrates that progress is relative, but no matter how harsh the life of the Spartans, they have always made their place in history. I hope you liked this video. If yes, subscribe to the channel, put your like down below, and see you in the next video.